My wife, whom I loved with all my heart, cheated on me with another man, and instead of apologizing, she openly stated that she would take everything from me to the last thread. Now I will tell this story from the very beginning. I never thought I'd be that guy, the one who walks in on his wife with another man. The thought alone is like something out of a nightmare you convince yourself would never happen. But there I was, standing in the doorway of my own house, frozen, as Sarah, my wife of 15 years, scrambled to cover herself. My name's Evan Turner, 41, a construction engineer by trade and a husband by choice, one I made with every fiber of my heart. Sarah and I weren't a whirlwind romance. No, ours was a steady fire, built up over the years, the kind of partnership I thought could withstand anything. Sarah was my confidant, my rock, my future. Or so I believed. We met when I was just getting on my feet, working long shifts and fighting to secure the next contract. Sarah was my foundation, pushing me when I needed it, holding me steady when life was chaotic. She was smart, ambitious, and relentless in her own career, too. She earned her MBA after we married and climbed up to a senior position in marketing. We'd built our life together, always talking about the future, the dreams we were working toward. That Saturday, I got off work early, feeling the rare pleasure of an open afternoon. The house was quiet when I came in, and I thought she might still be out, maybe grocery shopping or grabbing coffee. But as I got closer to the bedroom, I heard voices, her laugh, low and unmistakably flirtatious. The sound was so foreign to me in that moment that I had to stop, like my brain couldn't connect it to the woman I knew. But when I reached the door and saw her, everything came crashing down in a split second. She was in bed with a man I didn't recognize. There was no shock on her face, no shame. Sarah just froze, staring at me like I was an intruder in my own life. The stranger fumbled to gather his clothes, mumbling an apology I barely heard. It was like my ears refused to process the words. The only thing I felt was a low, pulsing disbelief, a shock so deep it was beyond anger. She didn't say anything, didn't try to cover herself, or even pretend to care that I just found her this way. She just gave me that same familiar look she'd had for the last year or so, like she'd been waiting for this day to come. "Evan," she said finally, her voice calm and matter-of-fact, "we need to talk." I wasn't ready to talk. I wasn't ready for anything. I just stood there, mute, my chest tightening like a vice. There was nothing left to say. She had already destroyed what I thought I'd known, and she did it with the kind of ease you might reserve for ending a conversation that had simply gone on too long. The man left without a word, slipping past me in a hurry, and Sarah just watched him go, only looking back at me when he was gone. Her face was cold, without a hint of remorse. I wanted her to explain herself, to tell me why she had done this to us, why she would throw away everything we had built together. But the longer she looked at me, the more I realized I was the only one who felt shattered. "I've been thinking about this for a while, Evan," she said, her voice so measured it almost sounded rehearsed. "This marriage hasn't been working for me. I deserve a life that makes me happy." She looked at me as though it should be obvious, as though I should have known. But I didn't. I had spent years believing we were solid, that we were working toward the same future. Sarah was everything to me, the reason I worked so hard, so we could build this life together. She went on, detailing her plans with an eerie detachment that only deepened the pit in my stomach. This wasn't some fling, some moment of weakness. This was a choice she'd been making for a long time. And now that it was all out in the open, she didn't just want to end things. She wanted everything. She wanted to walk away with the life I'd spent years building. "Evan," she said, "I'll be filing for divorce. I've already spoken to my lawyer." She kept her eyes on me, not a flicker of emotion in them. "The house, the savings, your shares in Taylor & Sons. I'm entitled to those. I supported you through every promotion, every overtime hour." Her words hit like blows, one after the other. The home I'd put my sweat and soul into, our savings, the years of my life spent building something solid. It was all on her list. She felt entitled to it, as if our life together had been some kind of business arrangement that she was simply cashing out of. For days, I moved through my life in a daze, trying to process it all. Sarah came and went, taking more and more of her things to David's place. I spent hours running through every word she'd said to me that afternoon, hearing her cold, callous tone as she dismantled our life piece by piece. I'd loved a woman who had been carefully, methodically, planning her exit, waiting for the right moment to gut me. And then, almost as if she knew what I was going through, she had the gall to start flaunting her relationship with David. She didn't even pretend to care about how it hurt. To her, I was a leftover piece in a life she was finished with, an inconvenience on her way to something she considered better. One day, a formal letter arrived from her lawyer, a demand for a substantial share of everything we owned. Our house, the savings, even a part of my retirement. She wanted monthly support too, money I knew she didn't need but simply wanted to take out of spite. It was almost poetic, her sense of entitlement. She had planned this so well that I wondered if our entire marriage had just been the scaffolding for her future escape. Every moment we'd spent together, every sacrifice I'd made, was nothing more than a stepping stone to her new life. But even though I felt defeated, I knew I couldn't let her have it all. I hired a lawyer, a sharp, focused guy named Grant who looked at me with cautious sympathy when I told him everything. "Evan, we can fight this," he said, "but she's set things up in her favor, and it's going to be a long, uphill battle." At first, I thought about just leaving it, letting her have what she wanted. But something inside me refused to let her win. Not like this. I had to do more than just fight for my savings or my home. I had to fight for the life she'd robbed me of. She had taken our love, my loyalty, and twisted it into a weapon, something she could use to tear me apart, and I wouldn't let her walk away without consequence. So I spent every spare minute I had working with Grant, combing through bank statements, texts, receipts, anything that could help me piece together a case. I wasn't just going to fight her. I was going to make sure she understood that I wouldn't let her destroy me without a battle. But seeing her in those moments, casually discussing her demands with Grant and me, hurt almost as much as her betrayal. She looked at me with cold eyes, occasionally glancing at her phone, tapping away messages to David as if this entire process were an annoyance she couldn't wait to be done with. It was clear she felt I had already lost. In her eyes, I was nothing more than a chapter she'd closed. But that chapter wasn't over, not yet. If she wanted to play this game, then I was ready to meet her on her level. She might have broken my heart, but I was going to make sure she didn't take my future with it. I set out to win. Days blurred together after the night I walked in on Sarah with David. It wasn't just the shock of betrayal anymore. It was the steady, venomous realization that she had mapped this all out. She wasn't leaving things to chance. She was plotting a clear course to take everything I'd spent my life building. I spent those days reeling. Every corner of the house felt wrong. My own home, with its carefully chosen furniture, the pictures on the walls. Every detail held reminders of a life we'd built, a life that Sarah seemed to believe belonged to her alone now. I had to remind myself why I was fighting, that giving up would be exactly what she wanted. Sarah expected me to crumble, to let her walk away with everything, including my dignity. But if she thought I'd roll over and hand her the life I'd fought to create, she didn't know me as well as she thought. The legal demands kept coming. Each one was more absurd than the last. The house, a majority of our savings, spousal support, even my stocks in Taylor & Sons. It wasn't enough for her to end things. She wanted to obliterate any trace that I'd ever existed in her life. One day, I remember my lawyer, Grant, setting down a thick file he'd prepared. He looked at me across the desk with an expression I'd come to recognize, grim sympathy. "Evan," he said, leafing through the papers with a sigh, "you're in a tough spot here. If we fight her, she'll push back harder. But if we don't, she's going to strip you of nearly everything." Grant laid out our options. We could either try to negotiate for a settlement that didn't rob me blind or prepare for a full-scale legal brawl that could go on for months. But what I hadn't expected were the silent battles, Sarah's quiet psychological games, the way she'd continue to undermine and wear me down. I'd thought her betrayal had gutted me, but the days that followed would show me how little I knew of what she was capable of. Sarah didn't just take over the house. She commandeered it like it was some kind of victory prize. She moved things around, filling spaces with her belongings as if to erase any sign I'd ever been there. Her clothes took over both closets. Framed photos of her and David appeared on surfaces that once held pictures of us. It was as if she was rebranding our life as her own, re-scripting it in a way that made my place in it look irrelevant. Once, she even invited David over. I came home to find him standing in our kitchen, leaning against the counter like he owned the place. He looked at me without an ounce of remorse, like he had every right to be there. "Good to see you, Evan," he said smoothly, extending a hand I ignored. I looked to Sarah, who stood there with a faint smile, amused at the scene she'd orchestrated. "David's here to help me with some things," she said, as though that explained anything. It took every ounce of restraint I had to keep my hands from trembling. Instead, I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You think you're going to get everything, don't you?" She tilted her head, a flicker of something almost like pity in her gaze. "I just think you need to accept reality, Evan. This is happening, whether you like it or not." That night, I stayed at a friend's house. I couldn't bear to be under the same roof with her and her new reality. As I sat on the couch, replaying her words, it dawned on me that this was exactly what she wanted. To wear me down, push me out, and walk away unscathed. She was counting on me giving up, and with each new escalation, each insult and manipulation, she chipped away at the life I'd thought we'd built together. It was like watching a house you'd built by hand, brick by brick, go up in flames, and not being able to put out the fire. The next few days, I started digging. Sarah might have covered her tracks, but I had been there, through all of it, through every job she'd taken, every investment she'd made. I knew she'd taken liberties with our finances, made expenditures that weren't hers to make. And if I had any chance at all in this case, I needed proof. One evening, I found an opening. Sarah was out, likely with David, and I went through our shared accounts, scrutinizing every transaction. Buried among the regular bills and deposits were expenses I hadn't noticed before. A series of checks made out to someone named Lindsay Hale. They were frequent, small enough to be overlooked but steady, like a drip from a leaky faucet. When I asked Grant about it the next day, his eyebrows shot up. "If those checks weren't authorized, then we're looking at misuse of funds," he said thoughtfully. "This Lindsay Hale could be a front, someone she's using to move money discreetly. If we can trace these funds, it could turn the tables." We dug deeper. By the end of the week, we'd learned that Lindsay Hale was a friend of David's, someone Sarah had funneled thousands of dollars to over the last few years. To this day, I don't know what that money was really used for, but Grant assured me that this was our angle. We had proof that Sarah had siphoned off money from our accounts for purposes that had nothing to do with our marriage. The ground beneath her airtight case was starting to crack. As we gathered evidence, I also began keeping tabs on her activities. If I needed to prove that she wasn't the supportive, loyal wife she'd made herself out to be, I had to find something to show in court. I started piecing together her routine, connecting the dots of her nights with David, the times she drained our accounts, the way she'd positioned herself for this exit plan. In the meantime, Sarah seemed to enjoy flaunting her progress toward her new life. She'd parade in front of me in designer clothes, things I'd never seen her buy, things I knew she'd bought on our joint account. It was like she was testing me, daring me to react. And still, she kept her visits with David unapologetically in the open, as if to erase any doubt in my mind that she'd already moved on. But the moment that really drove the knife in happened one night when I came home after a long meeting with Grant. I found Sarah in the living room, sitting comfortably on the sofa with David, their hands intertwined. They were laughing softly, their heads close together. The sight alone made my blood run cold, but it was what she said that broke me. "Oh, Evan, you're back," she said, barely turning to acknowledge me. "David and I were just discussing some ideas for renovating the house. It needs a change, don't you think?" There was no restraint in her voice, no attempt to mask her contempt. It was as if she was intentionally flaunting the fact that she had already replaced me, that David was her partner now, even in my own home. I managed to nod, forcing myself to remain composed. "Well, if you plan to make changes, you'd better be prepared to pay for them yourself," I said quietly. Her laugh was light, dismissive, and only deepened my resolve. Over the next few weeks, I ramped up our efforts with Grant. I tracked everything, documented every encounter, every detail that could cast doubt on her credibility. It was exhausting, grueling work, but I knew that if I had any hope of winning this fight, I couldn't let up for even a second. As the court date drew closer, I could see a hint of nervousness in Sarah's eyes. She didn't say it, but she could sense my resolve, the fact that I wasn't backing down. For the first time, she looked at me like I was a real threat, and that gave me strength. It was a quiet night, just days before we were due in court, when she finally cracked. She confronted me, her face a mask of frustration as she demanded, "Evan, why are you making this so difficult? Just give me what I want, and we can both move on." I looked at her, the woman I'd once thought I'd spend my life with, and I felt nothing but a cold clarity. "You want to destroy everything we've built, and you expect me to just let you?" I asked, my voice steady. "I don't know what kind of man you thought I was, Sarah, but I'm not giving you the satisfaction." Her face twisted in anger, her cool composure slipping for the first time. "You won't win, Evan," she hissed. "I'll see to that." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She could tear me down, but I was ready to take whatever was left and rebuild on my own. If she thought she'd already won, she was in for a surprise. The day in court finally arrived. I'd barely slept the night before, the anxiety gnawing at me in waves. Sarah showed up looking composed, dressed sharply in a dark green suit that somehow managed to make her look both innocent and commanding. She was surrounded by her legal team, who gave her quick, comforting nods as she took her seat across from me. I could see a glint of satisfaction in her eyes, a smugness that said she still thought she had everything under control. But she didn't know everything. Not yet. Grant leaned over and whispered, "You ready for this?" I nodded, keeping my eyes forward. We'd spent countless hours preparing, poring over every detail of the case to ensure we were airtight. The evidence of Sarah's financial misconduct was our trump card, and while it wouldn't necessarily win me everything, it gave us leverage, enough to make her nervous. The hearing started, and her lawyer, an older man with a voice as smooth as silk, immediately launched into his pitch, painting Sarah as the supportive wife who had sacrificed so much for my career. He spoke about the house, the partnership she'd maintained through my long hours, and the life she was owed for the years she'd invested in me. To hear him tell it, she was a saint, a selfless partner betrayed by a husband too busy to notice her needs. I watched Sarah, her face painted in soft remorse as she nodded along, pretending as if this life she was demanding had been a shared one, that she hadn't, in fact, shattered it with her own hands. When her lawyer brought up her financial sacrifices for our shared future, Grant couldn't contain a small, knowing smirk. When it was our turn, Grant started slow, pointing out the blatant inconsistencies in her demands, gently but thoroughly picking apart the financial sacrifices her lawyer had praised. He presented the monthly account statements we'd collected, each one highlighting where Sarah had drawn money from our joint account to fund her nights out, her gifts to David, and her suspicious transactions with Lindsay Hale. The room grew silent, a tension building as Sarah's carefully crafted narrative began to unravel. Her face remained stoic, but I could see her grip on the table tighten. Then, it was my turn to speak. I stood, and with a calm voice I hadn't expected from myself, told the judge about the night I'd come home early and found Sarah with another man in our bed. I spoke about the years of loyalty, the long hours and weekends I'd worked, not for myself, but for the life I thought we were building together. I didn't look at her as I spoke. I didn't need to. I could feel her gaze on me, like a spotlight, as she realized she no longer held the script. When I finished, Grant pulled out one last piece of evidence. He produced an envelope of photos taken by a private investigator. Sarah and David, their business dinners that stretched into late nights, the expensive weekends away while I'd been working double shifts. The judge looked at the photos carefully before passing them along to Sarah's lawyer, who visibly stiffened as he examined each one. Sarah's lawyer attempted to pivot, calling her to the stand to salvage her side of the story. She stepped up with practiced composure, painting a picture of a lonely wife, neglected and emotionally abandoned by a husband more interested in his job than his marriage. She had tears in her voice, a soft quiver that could have been convincing if I hadn't known her so well. But the judge, now suspicious, listened with an air of skepticism. When Grant got his chance to cross-examine, he was merciless. He asked about the frequent transfers to Lindsay, the unexplainable charges, and the weekends with David. Each question chipped away at her calm, until finally, she broke. I saw her blink rapidly, her eyes flicking to her lawyer, searching for rescue, but he had none to offer. She was on her own. As the hearing wrapped up, Sarah's lawyer proposed an amended settlement, a reduced share of the house and a modest monthly support allowance. It was a far cry from the life she'd envisioned. But we pressed on, Grant insisting that we'd take it all to court if need be, revealing the depths of her betrayal and financial misconduct. The judge scheduled a follow-up, but his words carried a weight that suggested he'd already made his mind up. Walking out of the courthouse, Grant patted me on the back. "We've got her on the ropes, Evan. Now it's up to her to decide how much she's willing to lose." Outside, Sarah was waiting, her posture rigid, arms crossed. She looked at me with a mixture of anger and something else, a hint of desperation I'd never seen in her before. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice tight. "You know what I deserve. This was our life. I'm entitled to it." I looked at her, searching for some trace of the woman I thought I'd known, the one I'd loved so deeply and trusted without question. But there was nothing familiar in her face now, just a stranger's steely resolve. "What you're entitled to, Sarah," I said quietly, "is exactly what you've earned." She held my gaze, her face twisting as though she wanted to respond but couldn't find the words. Finally, she just shook her head, giving me one last withering look before walking away. In that moment, I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. After the court hearing, Sarah stopped playing nice. Gone were the feigned sadness, the theatrical remorse. What emerged was a ruthless determination to get what she wanted, no matter the cost. She must have known her case was unraveling, that the judge was seeing through her polished veneer. But instead of giving up, she doubled down. The weeks leading up to the final ruling were a nightmare. Sarah started calling me at all hours, each conversation more venomous than the last. At first, I let her words wash over me, knowing her insults were only meant to wear me down, to make me feel guilty for standing my ground. But as the calls continued, I realized she wasn't just lashing out, she was testing my limits. One night, after a particularly grueling day, I came home to find a letter taped to my door. It was from Sarah's lawyer, demanding an immediate meeting to re-evaluate terms. She was threatening to drag things out further if I didn't agree to a new settlement, a settlement that would grant her ownership of the house and a much larger portion of our savings. I stood there in my darkened hallway, staring at the letter, wondering if she truly thought I would fold. Grant took one look at the letter the next morning and shook his head. "It's desperation," he said, "but that doesn't mean she won't try to make life difficult." That evening, I came home to find Sarah sitting on the front porch, waiting for me. The sight of her sitting there, perfectly composed, sent a chill through me. I'd asked her months ago to stay away, but Sarah, as usual, didn't respect boundaries unless they served her. "Evan," she said, standing as I approached, her voice smooth and measured. "We need to talk." "We have nothing to talk about," I replied, moving to unlock the door, but she stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "Fine, let's be direct." She narrowed her eyes, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You want this to be ugly? Then I'll make it ugly. You think a few bank statements and photos will sway the judge, but I can make sure you lose a lot more than you're bargaining for." "What are you talking about?" I asked, unable to hide my irritation. She smirked, leaning closer. "You really don't know, do you? I know things about you, Evan, things that could make your life difficult." My patience finally snapped. "You're threatening me now?" I said, incredulous. "Sarah, we both know what you've done. We both know who's in the wrong here." Her smile faded, and for a brief moment, I saw the real fear in her eyes, the doubt she'd been trying so hard to hide. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "If you don't want to negotiate, fine," she said, stepping back. "Just know that I won't make it easy for you." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement as if punctuating her resolve. I stood there, staring after her, wondering how I'd ever believed this woman was the love of my life. The following days were quiet, but the tension was building. I knew she was planning something. I just didn't know what. Then, a week before our final court date, I received a call from Grant. He sounded cautious. "Evan, something came up. Sarah's lawyer filed a last-minute motion claiming emotional and financial abuse. She's alleging that you manipulated her finances, and she's filed statements from friends who claim you were emotionally distant and controlling." The breath left my lungs as I tried to process his words. "What? That's absurd." "Of course it is," he said, "but it's enough to muddy the waters. Her team's trying to use it as leverage to negotiate a better settlement. They know the judge is leaning in your favor, so they're throwing everything they can into the mix." The next day in court, Sarah was on the stand, her voice quivering as she recounted exaggerated tales of my supposed emotional neglect. She spoke about feeling trapped, of having no choice but to turn to someone else because she felt abandoned. Her friends, two women I'd barely met, gave carefully rehearsed testimonies, painting me as a cold, distant husband who'd driven her into David's arms. Grant leaned over, whispering, "They're desperate, Evan. Just let them talk." When it was our turn to respond, Grant questioned her friends with sharp, focused questions, poking holes in their stories and forcing them to admit they'd had limited knowledge of our marriage. He then pulled out our evidence, messages between Sarah and David spanning over a year before our separation, photos, receipts, the series of bank statements showing Sarah's unauthorized transfers. Piece by piece, her narrative unraveled. But the turning point came when Grant brought up one last witness, a surprise for Sarah's team. It was the private investigator who'd followed her and David for months, collecting evidence of their relationship. He described, in detail, the elaborate extent Sarah had gone to hide her affair, her lies, her manipulation of our finances. It was damning. As he spoke, I glanced over at Sarah. She looked pale, her composure slipping as she realized her lies were collapsing in real time. For the first time, she was the one under scrutiny, exposed, vulnerable. By the time the judge dismissed us, her lawyer looked grim, barely able to muster a response to our evidence. The judge requested that we reconvene in a few days, giving both parties time to process the new developments. Outside, Sarah approached me one last time, her face a mask of rage and desperation. "You think you've won," she hissed. "But this isn't over, Evan. You'll regret this." But I didn't feel regret or anger or even triumph. All I felt was relief, a relief that the truth was finally, irrevocably, out in the open. The days after that hearing felt different. The endless pit of anxiety I'd carried around since the night I found Sarah with David was finally starting to ease. I no longer flinched every time my phone buzzed, no longer feared what Sarah might pull next. For the first time in months, I could see the finish line. When we reconvened in court, the atmosphere was subdued. Sarah's lawyer looked weary, his gaze darting anywhere but in my direction. Sarah, too, seemed a shadow of herself. She sat silently, her gaze fixed forward, her face devoid of the confident smugness she'd worn so proudly through each preceding session. The judge cleared his throat, looking down at the mound of evidence on his desk. He began his summation, his words pointed and deliberate. "It's clear that there has been an extensive deception here," he said, his tone clipped. "Mrs. Turner's actions, as demonstrated by the evidence, show a pattern of calculated behavior, misuse of marital assets, and a blatant disregard for marital vows." Sarah's lawyer rose to interject, but the judge held up a hand. "There is nothing left to add here. Mrs. Turner's own testimony and the testimonies of her witnesses lack credibility. This is no longer a question of entitlement, but of consequence." Grant leaned toward me, his voice a barely audible whisper. "This is it, Evan. He's on our side." The judge turned his attention directly to Sarah. "Mrs. Turner, your attempt to secure additional financial support has been denied. Given the evidence, you will forfeit your claim to the house, and your financial settlement will be reduced to the minimum required under state law." Sarah's face went ghostly white. Her lawyer gave a small shake of his head, resignation settling on his features. I felt the weight lift from my shoulders as I realized I'd won. She wouldn't be walking away with everything. She wouldn't get to rewrite our life to suit her ambitions. But then, Just as the judge was about to adjourn, Grant cleared his throat and made a last-minute request. Your Honor, in light of the extensive financial misuse, we request that Mr. Turner's legal fees be covered by Mrs. Turner's portion of the settlement. The judge considered this briefly before nodding. Approved. That final decision seemed to snap something in Sarah. Her carefully constructed composure cracked, and she stood abruptly, her voice trembling with anger. "This isn't fair," she shouted, her eyes darting around the room, searching for support that wasn't there. "He ruined my life. He doesn't deserve to win." But there was no sympathy in the room, only the quiet, cold reality of the consequences she'd brought upon herself. The judge's gavel hit the desk. "Mrs. Turner, sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." Slowly, she lowered herself back into her seat, her face twisted in barely restrained rage. The judge dismissed the case, and just like that, it was over. Outside the courthouse, Grant shook my hand firmly. "You did it, Evan. Not many people come out of something like this whole, but you did." "Thanks to you," I replied, feeling the relief settle in. But as Grant walked away, I noticed Sarah standing nearby, watching me with an intensity one hadn't seen before. She stepped toward me, her face twisted in a mix of fury and desperation. "You're going to regret this, Evan. You think you've won, but you're nothing without me." I looked at her, the woman I'd once believed in, the one I thought I'd spend my life with, and felt only a cold detachment. "You already took everything you could, Sarah. There's nothing left for me to regret." Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving her behind for good. In the weeks that followed, I began the slow process of rebuilding. The house felt emptier, quieter, but also lighter, like a weight had been lifted. I started focusing on my work again, reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with, rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under the strain of Sarah's betrayal. One day, I received a final letter from her lawyer, detailing the last of the legal formalities. As I read through it, a strange feeling washed over me. Not triumph or satisfaction, but closure. Sarah had spent so much of her life trying to control, manipulate, and take. Yet in the end, she'd left with nothing more than what she'd come into our marriage with. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was free. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.